Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring two of the great writers from antiquity, Homer and Plato. With me is Pierre Grimes, a specialist in ancient Greek philosophy, author of Philosophical Midwifery, author of Socrates and Jesus, a dialogue made in heaven, many other books as well, and the founder of the Noetic Society. Welcome, Pierre.
Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. You know, I have done interviews recently suggesting that Homer and Plato were very, very different, that Plato represented a radical change in Greek thought from a kind of fatalistic belief that our fate is in the hands of the gods to a belief that our fate, our destiny is controlled by our own character. But I gather that your research suggests something very different, especially with regard to Homer.
Yes, and Plato. But yes.
Because, I mean, if we look at Homer, it all begins, as I recall, with a quarrel amongst Venus and Athena as to who is the greatest of the goddesses. In order to win the golden apple that was thrown at a party by a rather minor goddess, Eris, who had been spurned. It certainly suggests that, the gods control our fates here.
I've heard that. I would rather approach it in a different way. I think my reading starts from the Odyssey. Because in the Odyssey, the Phaeacians, who are the last group Odysseus meets before he journeys back to Ithaca,
yes,
the king of the Phaeacians says that the Trojan War was designed to be a model so that it could be sung for the glory of man. Now, what does that mean? Then, according to the Odyssey, the Iliad should be sung before the gods or to the gods. Well, the very opening of Homer's Iliad is "Sing, goddess, the ruinous wrath of Achilles." It's singing to the gods. The whole thing is singing to the gods. Now, what does that mean? I take it by looking at Homer, you can discover the very principles of philosophical midwifery and Homer.
And those principles have to do, as we've discussed in several previous interviews, have something to do with an idea very much akin to enlightenment as it's thought of in Eastern traditions.
That's true. See, the question is, can we discuss Homer's Achilles as if he had a problem? And if he had a problem, does it correspond to what we understand when we study philosophical midwifery? That means there must have been an origin to the problem. It must have parental roots. It must come out of a specific beginning. The consequences of the teaching must be clear, and it must be fulfilled by the next generation. Well, where is that in Homer? See, Homer writes that Lord Phoenix was really the surrogate mother of Achilles because he didn't have a mother. His mother was a goddess, Thetis. So therefore, Lord Phoenix describes why he took care of Achilles. Even when he was young, he put him on his lap and he fed him and he raised him because he needed a grandson to take care of him in his old age.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then, is it possible that Lord Phoenix could have passed on a tradition about the Logos to Achilles?
Possible.
Now, in chapter 11, Lord Phoenix describes his early beginnings, and it has the same features that play themselves out with Achilles and Lord Agamemnon.
Mm-hmm.
His father had a ruinous desire, you might call, for a slave girl who was very akin to his mother. The mother wanted revenge, so she got her son Phoenix to seduce the woman, the slave girl,
Mm-hmm.
and she would then change her desires from the father to the son.
Uh-huh.
Revenge,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
So, ruinous desire, revenge.
Yeah.
And then at that moment, Lord Phoenix draws the sword to slay his father, but he's held back. Same thing took place with Achilles. He was about to slay Agamemnon. He pulled his sword. Athena, the goddess, said, "Wait a minute, hold fast." Very similar. Well then.
But Agamemnon now, was he
Yes.
like a father to Achilles?
Well, Agamemnon had the ruinous desire for Achilles' wife, Briseis.
Oh.
And he took her, grabbed her, and captured her, and therefore claimed that I'm going to go back to Ithaca, and she's going to be my wife. She's better than my own.
Because he had lost Helen.
Yeah. No, that's Paris. Yeah. So.
But no, Agamemnon had lost Helen.
Agamemnon, that's right. So then they both plan an escape. Phoenix had to escape from the family.
Yeah.
He had to leave the family and leave at night in order to find his fortune somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Achilles does. Because he devises a plan. He wants revenge. The sword event is parallel. So his plan was, I'm going to send my best friend into battle with my armor, and in the meantime, we're going to get from Agamemnon. He will think I'm in battle. He will then be so pleased at my participation in the war, which is critical. He will now return my wife and give me great gifts. I'll stow them aboard ship, and me and my men will secretly sail back to Ithaca and leave the army and leave Agamemnon to the fortunes of war with Hector.
Yes.
Similar.
Mm-hmm.
Achilles wants rewards in the future. Lord Phoenix wants rewards in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So he's passing on a parallel teaching, parallel incidents.
Yeah.
So Achilles finally has to say, look here, I see the consequences of my acts. This brought me to wake up. This whole thing I've been doing, I have to leave. I have to give it up.
Because his cousin, best friend, lover, Patroclus, was killed.
Yes. Yes.
Wearing Achilles' armor, he sent basically the man he loved the most into battle, assuming that, he'll be okay, but
Absolutely.
He was not.
Right.
He was killed by Hector, who thought he was killing Achilles.
Right. But in the meantime, Achilles thought he would gain great wealth in return of his wife, stow them aboard his ships, and sail back home.
So here we see what you call the pathologos, a false idea concerning who one is, one's identity.
Yeah.
Achilles...
the need for revenge is capital. We must end any injustice by destroying the victims. Yes, that's what we must do.
Yeah.
Right? So then he says, look here, I'm finished. I'm giving up my anger. He has a great line. He says, my anger is as sweet as dripping honey.
Mm-hmm.
I love that line.
Yeah. Well, and that's very good, because oftentimes we relish our anger. We get really self-righteous about it.
We feel so good about it.
Yeah.
Like dripping honey.
Uh-huh. and usually, when anger, of all things, feels that good,
power.
Maybe there's a problem.
Maybe there's a problem.
Yeah.
So when he said, I'm putting down my anger, giving up my desire, now I'm going to face the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And then, by the way, from that precipitates a enlightenment experience, a divine luminosity comes down to him. And its brilliance is so great in the daylight that it can be seen for miles at a distance.
Yeah. And now that resembles...
And by the way, at that moment, he says it's from the self.
Uh-huh. But that moment that you're describing now, Achilles filled with a divine luminosity, awakened to another reality, isn't that very much like Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita when Krishna reveals himself before they go into battle?
That's right. It's parallel.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. See, the difference, of course, is that for readers of the Bhagavad Gita, I would say he made the wrong decision. He should have gone and being a sannyasin.
Arjuna.
Yes.
But what about Achilles? Because he commits an act of revenge after this enlightenment.
He gives up his anger. That's his rib.
I disagree.
Okay.
I disagree with you there, because as I recall the story, Achilles not only slays Hector, but he takes his body and drags it around Troy 7 times.
Right.
So he is mutilating the body. Now, if that's not an act of revenge, you tell me what is.
Well, I don't think I can top it. And I'm quite willing to say you're right. I think that is a continuation of revenge.
So in spite of his enlightenment.
Oh, yeah. He can still have a problem, which is what we discussed some time ago.
We did.
And see, if it turns out then that he can then turn and become the great warrior, there's another thing he has to do. He has to allow Priam, the father
of Hector and the king of Troy.
Yes, to visit Achilles, and then they share one another their story.
Yes.
And that's very similar to the last act in Philosophical Midwifery. You have to explain what brought you there, the conflicts you have, and share them.
It's as if only after that act of revenge, because after all, Hector had killed Achilles' lover, that Achilles is finally able to unburden himself completely.
Yeah.
But
go ahead.
Well, the story isn't over yet, because Achilles himself is killed by the weakest of all the princes of Troy.
Yeah, but that's not in the story.
No. Okay.
Yeah. Now, the question is, if that's the central thesis that the Greeks nurtured for hundreds of years
about Achilles,
and the idea that they had an understanding of human nature they could use as a paradigm for understanding themselves.
Right.
Which is philosophical midwifery.
Yes, and we talked about this in our very first discussion of philosophical midwifery, how this story of Achilles turning himself around was a big inspiration to you. But subsequently, you have explained to me that it's not just Achilles, that throughout Homer, in hundreds and hundreds of places, there is this emphasis on the self.
Yes. It's a treatise on the way in which you can see the self, the variety of its expressions, all the way to the ultimate expression. That's true.
But isn't it the case, let's take the Odyssey for a moment.
Yes.
It takes Odysseus like 20 years to return home from the Trojan War. And he is delayed if I recall correctly, even though he has the aid of the goddess Athena, he is delayed because somewhere along the way he has aroused the ire of Poseidon.
That's right.
The god of the ocean.
Right.
So Achilles' fate is still and he's a very clever man. I mean, not Achilles, Odysseus. Odysseus is, if I recall correctly, the name itself, Odysseus, means a man of many turnings.
Yes. Wily Odysseus, quite true.
I mean, they're one of the most interesting characters in all of literature, I would say, but his fate is still in the hands of the gods. It's between Athena and Poseidon whether or not he's going to make it home.
And the only question is it possible that there's a conflict of principles? That's the way it can be read.
Yes.
But what I find interesting to link this with Plato, nowhere in Plato does he have the idea that you can understand human nature in terms of these paradigms. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. In the Republic, he says, hey, Homer is the wrong author to use in your education.
Oh. And why does he say that?
He never saw the pathological. He never saw what Homer saw.
Yeah.
And that's one of his weaknesses.
But explain why Plato criticized Homer.
Well, several reasons. One of the reasons is he objects to the view of the gods, the way the gods are portrayed. And another reason, which seems to him, is that there is no philosophical point to the story itself. It's just a tale.
Yeah.
And he then says, no one has ever used Homer as a model for education or for a state. And that's important for Plato.
Yeah. But now, why does he object to Homer's characterization of the gods?
Well, he in the Republic, he takes issue with mythology, and especially he uses the example, which is very, very interesting, of Zeus, his father, Kronos, his father, Uranus.
Yes.
And that's a story where the one castrates the other consecutively.
Yes.
Right? And Plato says this should not be told in our Republic. This should have nothing to do with our education.
So I think that myth of Uranus and Kronos and Zeus is exceedingly important.
Exceedingly
important.
Oh, I do too.
Because it has to do with, you can bring Prometheus into the picture as well, rebelling against Zeus, although I don't think Prometheus was the son of Zeus. No. But it has to do with the idea of rebelling against the great authority God.
I take it differently. You see, one of the problems that early Greeks had, is it possible there can be another universe? Is there enough room in the universe for another entirely separate universe with a separate God playing out another game? That was their question. So by using this myth, all right, Zeus is a creator God.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Kronos represents the ideas of creation, ideally. Therefore, he's the ideas for creation. The origin of those ideas is Uranus. Wait a minute now. If then, after creation, Kronos castrates Uranus, then there can't be any more Kronos. There can no longer be any suns. Therefore, there can only be one universe. Wait a minute. Only one set of ideas for the universe.
Yeah.
Now, if Zeus castrates Kronos, then that means there can't be any more Zeuses or creators.
So the sense is that in overthrowing the old order, they establish a new order, which is just as bad.
Well, then you have to say, well, then how is it that this universe, since it's only one, allows all the infinite possibilities to emerge within it? Now they have a different kind of problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I understand the myth.
Okay.
But for Plato, he says, no more. However, he uses Homer in very key points in the Republic.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the places is in the 7th book, when he talks about those in the cave. And he says, anyone who would want to be king of these people, he said, I would much prefer to be the poor slave to a landless lord than be master of all of the dead that lie here.
The people inside the cave.
Yeah,
Plato's cave.
That quote comes out of Homer.
Oh.
See, so that he uses Homer when he needs to make a point. But
well, of course, Homer's the great poet.
Yeah, but he doesn't use the exploration of the human psyche and how Achilles was able to see the nature of his problem and get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's missing.
Yeah.
Equally well, Plato doesn't have a way of understanding that he makes explicit, by the way, or in any detail, how people can get out of being subjects of the allegory of the cave, be prisoners. Mm-hmm. They can't move right or left. They're only chained in such a way to see only the shadows on the wall of the cave.
Right.
He doesn't say how they can remove the chains.
Mm.
Those are beliefs.
Right.
So he doesn't have a way of explaining that.
Uh-huh.
Therefore, he misses a key element in Homer.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, that's a weakness.
Doesn't Plato also suggest in the Republic, when he says we can't teach the people the myths of Homer any longer because it's not, we don't want them brought up that way.
That's right.
He's sort of suggesting that the philosopher kings who would rule the society should make up stories that they think are more acceptable or will help people to become more upright citizens.
Noble lie.
The noble lie.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Plato is advocating essentially that.
Yeah. But you see, Book 2 of the Republic, Socrates is pressed by Agathon. Agathon says, look, what we did just before, which is the first book of the Republic, is all the arguments against the idea of injustice. Mm-hmm. Right? But we haven't talked about the nature of justice. It's not enough to show the weakness in positions that you can describe as positions of unjust. You now have to demonstrate that there is a rational way to understand justice, and it's essential for man and society. So Socrates says, oh, wait a minute. In order to do that, I need an analogy. I'll create an analogy of the state to show the dynamics that are present in the soul.
Mm-hmm.
That's the purpose of the state. It is not designed as a practical model for statehood.
Right.
In Book 9, at the end of Book 9, Glaucon says, hey, wait a minute. Do you think the state we've been creating through 9 books, do you think it'll ever come into existence? Socrates says, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it only exists as a model in the heavens for us to contemplate. But whether it exists now or ever will is of no consequence to me.
Mm-hmm. So it's very clear by that passage that Plato is writing about the self, or
the soul and the self. Right.
The psyche.
That's it.
We might
That's
say.
his real goal.
Yeah.
And he's using the state as an analogy which spins through. By the way, the construction of the state is over at Book 4. He says, well, that's it. We've done it.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk about philosophy.
For the next 5 books.
6, 7, right?
Yeah.
That's about philosophy, which is the way he characterizes how shall we make a philosopher king.
Yeah.
And by the way, there is only, of the studies that they must consume or master, arithmetic, geometry, right? Solid geometry, which isn't taught, astronomy, music, and dialectic. There's only one question that runs through the whole thing, only one question. And that is, what after all is the one self?
Mm-hmm.
Self.
Yeah. So that, as you see it, is Plato's ultimate focus.
Yeah. And everybody, by the way, when they translate, they take the word self out, and they have in its place, what after all is the one itself?
Mm-hmm. So they've replaced the word self with itself, typically.
Oh, yeah. And they're different Greek words. One has an epsilon, one does not in front of it.
Uh-huh.
There's no doubt about it.
But there was something in the mindset of the translators, interpreters who came out of a different cultural epoch where they were obviously uncomfortable with the pure mysticism being expressed by Plato.
Yes, just that could get you killed.
Mm-hmm.
And did.
And did. That's right. We have the example of Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake.
Yeah. Matter of fact, the last person that they destroyed or killed was in Mexico in 1932. The Catholic Church burned one of them. So it's only because they lost political power that we no longer have them dominating our culture.
And I just learned, this is really a parenthetical comment, not related to our present discussion, but the last person imprisoned for witchcraft in England was in 1943.
Really?
Yes. Yes, her name was Helen Duncan, and she was a medium and was apparently a very gifted psychic, at least according to some accounts, and had hundreds of people testifying at her trial that she was able to produce materializations of their deceased relatives. And the British government apparently was afraid that if some of these deceased British soldiers came back through this medium, they would reveal wartime secrets. So they wanted to shut her up. And so they put her on trial for witchcraft and sent her to prison for 9 months.
Well, I'm sure glad it was only 9 months. She would have been dead in an earlier time.
Uh-huh. Well, anyway, it's a parenthetical story, but it does deal with this tension between the mystical personality confronting a materialistic world.
Well, given enough time, I think all mankind will be the same. They'll all be mystics. Mm-hmm. That's where we're going.
Yeah. I tend to think so. But now let's talk about Homer.
Yes.
Again, let's come back to Homer for a moment. We've established Plato is, from your point of view, as you see it philosophically, and it strikes me as I would say it's accurate, but minimally it's reasonable. It's a reasonable interpretation.
Yes.
I'm under the impression that what you're suggesting is, even though Plato in the Republic says we can't teach Homer to our children, Homer was somehow still an inspiration to Plato.
No doubt. Mm-hmm. But he didn't see this dimension.
Yeah.
He also, like in the Apology, Socrates says, it's from dreams and visions that have guided him.
Yeah.
But there's nowhere in Plato where he unpacks dreams and helps us understand a way to understand dreams. Mm-hmm. Now, that is present in Synesius's work in the 2nd century. And he apologizes for writing it. In the beginning of it, he says, well, this is pretty obvious. Mm-hmm. And then he outlines a beautiful way to understand dreams, which is the same way we do.
Synesius.
Yes.
Who is the earliest work on dream interpretation.
The first person to put it in writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since it plays such a heavy role in the Greek culture and all the plays and in Homer, that there must have been a matter of fact. There was no physician in those days that treated a patient before the patient was able to record and deliver the content of their dreams.
Yeah. Well,
before any treatment began.
The ancient healing temples, the Asclepions, were sleep temples. People came to those temples to have dreams and to be healed.
So someone must have understood them to help people with their dreams.
And they are much older than Plato.
Oh, that's true.
So what you seem to be suggesting is that Homer had more of an appreciation for the nuances of human psychology and perhaps even psychotherapy than Plato.
That's true.
Plato didn't have an appreciation for psychotherapy at all.
That's right.
Even though he was, as we've described him, I'm using the phrase pure, mystic.
Yeah. See, in the Phaedo, there's a section that you can say is the yoga of death.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes it by saying, see, the issue is what is death? And then finally he says, death is a purification. And what he means by purification, he says that it's necessary to collect from all parts of the body, the soul.
Is this Socrates speaking?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Bring together all parts of the soul from the body, collect it together external to the body, so that it then can perceive the nature of the divine.
Mm-hmm.
One paragraph, 2 sentences, nothing else.
But it's very clear.
Well, I would say...
At least as you describe it.
Yeah. But nonetheless, someone else might have said, excuse me, do you need anything else? Any more suggestions? Like, I understand breathing is important. Or, how long should this practice go? By the way, did you do it, Socrates? And how long have you been practicing this? None of that is in the works.
Oh, in other words, they're not just describing what happens at death. They're describing a practice for the living.
To die before they're dead.
Like to engender an out-of-body experience.
That's right. That's what he's doing.
Yeah.
Indeed, right? Near-death experiences. That's what he's doing. Well, and he's saying that's a yoga for the divine.
I am under the impression that and we've talked about this, I believe, the Greek mysteries, the Eleusinian mystery traditions, for example, it was kept secret.
Magnificently.
Yes, hermetically sealed, you might say.
Yes.
People wouldn't reveal very much about it. Even now, centuries later, we have very little that we know about the mysteries, except that people who went through the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, pretty much all reported they lost their fear of death.
That's right. That's right. And they spent 6 months before entering into the Eleusinian mysteries to study.
So, I mean, that has to be the case, then, that these mysteries, which are very ancient, much older than Plato, represent a very advanced form of, I'm going to call it psychotherapy, but it's much more than that. It's a...
Pharmacological pharmacotherapy.
Yes, yeah, and well integrated into the culture because all of the leading citizens went through the mysteries and felt that it really changed their life.
And the only requirement is you have to have been knowledgeable in Greek, speak Greek. That was the only requirement.
Mm-hmm.
So foreigners could get in if they knew Greek. So it was open. Yet it was secret.
Yeah.
And it turns out, of course, that Wasson said that substance is LSD.
Mm.
See, but we don't educate our people to say, look here, before you play with LSD, why not engage in 6 months of study? You need a certain kind of study and preparation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Or it may happen and you're not prepared to integrate it.
Mm-hmm.
That's our missing part in our culture.
Yeah. Well,
I was present at an LSD experiment where I was with several of us, and this woman dropped LSD. Within 20 minutes, she looked up and she said, I want out. I don't care what's happening. I want out. That's how terrifying it can be for some people.
Sure.
And therefore, the Greek view that, you need a certain amount of time and preparation is a very important element in the success of that mystic experiment.
And I gather the Greek mysteries was a very, very controlled and detailed and involved environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can match that. We have the technology. We could have one.
Yeah.
But we don't.
Well, again, parenthetically, I will say that one of my mentors, a person I greatly admire, Jean Houston, has been running what she calls a mystery school for decades.
Oh, I've read her stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm an admirer of her work. I didn't know she started a school, though.
Well, it's not exactly. It's called a mystery school, and it involves like 9 weekends a year, or it did in those days. I don't know that it's happening any longer. And it's also worth mentioning in parentheses, I believe it's in her book, A Mythical Life. She has a deep, I would call it an archetypal synchronistic connection with Proclus.
Ooh, that I will get. What's the name of the work?
It's called A Mythical Life.
I have it.
Yeah. Oh,
tomorrow morning I'll have it in my hand.
But it would be fair to say, I think it's almost a certainty that Plato would have gone through the mysteries.
Yeah, that's true.
And I imagine that very likely true. Homer as well.
Because he mentions in the Meno, he says to Anytos, aren't you going to stay around for the mysteries? So yes, he does mention them, and he considers it favorable, and he thinks that Anytos, who's quite angry at him, and he's one of the accusers that brought about the trial and the persecution of Socrates, that he needs to go to the mysteries.
So underlying, many scholars would say Homer very, very different from Plato. And as I mentioned earlier, the Greeks prior to the rise of philosophy were thought to have been fatalistic, but underneath both the philosophical Greek tradition and the poetic Greek tradition, you have these mysteries.
That's true. In spite of those things, they're contributed greatly to mankind and man's quest for enlightenment.
Yeah.
But Proclus unpacks it all. That's why Proclus is so important. I didn't know Jean Houston got into Proclus.
Oh, yes, very much so.
Very.
Well, she tells me that I've discussed it with her. She said that when she was a child, she would hear a little voice in her head saying, "Hocus pocus, where is Proclus?"
Oh.
Yeah.
Then she probably, yeah. What year was that?
When this happened to her?
No. When did she get the Proclus? Do you know any dates?
No, I really don't, but I would assume, Jean Houston is 80 years old today, and this may have occurred when she was 12.
Yeah.
So she's had a lifelong fascination with Proclus at a deep, I call it the archetypal level. Just as I have a similar relationship I may never have discussed with you with the ancient Roman philosopher Seneca.
Oh, Seneca. Yeah. Well, another one that you should enjoy getting into if you haven't is Sextus Empiricus.
Oh, no, I haven't.
And he's the father of Pyrrhonianism, which he developed into a dialectic, which Alexander the Great's a contingent of philosophers that joined him in Taxlia brought to Taxlia, that became the same kind of metaphysics that Nagarjuna developed. There's a kinship between Nagarjuna's dialectic and Sextus Empiricus. If you have two works together, you can see the images and the metaphors are the same. So Sextus Empiricus, can help you understand
Nagarjuna.
Right. I've always wondered what would have happened had Alexander the Great taken some Platonists rather than Aristotelians, who were much more akin to the Pyrrhonists of Sextus Empiricus.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, Alexander is one example of that bridge between the Greek culture and the Indian culture. But I think there are earlier examples, because the migration of Aryans out of the, I suppose, the Caucasus region, some went to India and some went west into Europe.
Right. That's right. That's right.
So you get the correlation between the Greek and the Hindu pantheons is not accidental.
Watson suggests that yoga was was necessary to develop because the Aryans coming from the north had a kinship with the magic mushrooms.
Oh.
And since they no longer had access to the magic mushrooms, since they were akin to pine needles that become the source of their growth, they had to develop another way of reaching the divine, and that was the yoga tradition.
I see. Well,
Watson says that, by the way.
I know there are other stories regarding the origins of yoga that would take it back to a much earlier time, I think. Pre-Aryan India. We've covered an awful lot of ground, and we've deviated a bit from our focus on Homer and Plato. But what I'm getting out of the discussion is that as different as they may seem, the blind poet and the founder of an academy that lasted for 1,000 years nearly, while they may seem very, very different, there are quite a few similarities.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. They are both on a higher level rationalists.
Yeah.
They both want to understand. Their object of understanding may have different depths, but they share in the same kind of interest in representing intellectually and philosophically and rationally a coherent view of the universe and mankind. Yeah.
And, we often associate Plato and Homer with the Western tradition, and then people often say, well, if you want to understand enlightenment, you really have to turn to the East, to the Hindu and Buddhist sages. But you, as a philosopher who spent your life studying all of these traditions, seem to find more authentic wisdom in the Greeks.
Well, I was working with a Buddhist, a Korean Buddhist, very insightful gentleman indeed, Myobong, and he attended my Friday night sessions, never said anything, sat in the back row. And then, after a couple of months, he said, Pierre, come and visit me in my temple. So I went up in the temple, or tea. He said, here, and there's a stick. Dharma stick. He said, you're my Dharma successor. I said, wait a minute, I'm not a teacher. I only teach reading. I teach people how to read in depth, but I'm not a teacher of anything. I don't have any doctrine I'm teaching. He said, yes, you do. He said, I'll make a deal with you. I'll translate the Diamond Sutra every Thursday night. You can only have 3 to 5 minutes to look it over, and you have to talk about it. You'll see that you are a teacher. You will be able to show the group a divine insight into it. That's the way you think. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll do it if you do the same thing with Plato's Parmenides. He said, you're in. So sure enough, when I got to chapter 25 in the Diamond Sutra, it was remarkable. And he said, there it is, there's the proof. So I became a Dharma successor. And we started a school that combined Plato and Buddhism. And that became his temple in Southern California. So I'm a priest that was never a monk, that joined the Buddhist order He then brought me into the Buddhist order as a Platonist, and we had worked together. His temple joining Plato and Buddhism.
And now we've talked over and over again about the Plato as a pure mystic, along the same lines as Buddha or Nagarjuna. And yet I'm under the impression, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that you find even greater inspiration and greater wisdom in Homer.
I guess that's true. Yes. And I'm now it's opened up I'm really anxious to get into it. I'm looking forward to the wealth of material that has just developed. I have a friend of mine who identified all the uses of the idea of autos, or self, in Homer, and it accounts for hundreds of instances. Yeah. So I'm going back into the English translation and putting them all in order to understand it on this level.
In other words, you are inspiring a whole new generation of translations of the Greek classics, because you're of the opinion that they become greatly distorted over the centuries.
Yeah.
What a magnificent ambition to have.
Yes.
Very important work, Pierre.
Yes, it is.
And I can see here you are, I think it's useful for our readers to know that you're a man in your mid-90s.
That's true.
And maybe you need to live that long to take on a project of such significance.
Yeah, but going into it, I have the sense that I'm 25.
And speaking with you, I have the same sense. Pierre Grimes, what a pleasure.
My pleasure indeed. Enjoy it, always enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
My deepest pleasure.
And thank you
for
being with us.
Yes, indeed.